12. Mr. Hale. After Mr. Bell's departure, life returned to what it had been before his visit. 4 months passed. Margaret tried to keep herself busy visiting the Boucher children, and was always kind and attentive to her father. But the truth was that she felt bored and miserable. Mr. Thornton seldom came to his lessons, partly because, as a result of the strike, his business affairs had become more complicated. When he did come, he never asked to see Margaret, and often sent a note at the last moment saying that he was too busy for a lesson. Although Mr. Hale had new pupils to replace Mr. Thornton, he missed their conversations and became quite depressed by his pupils' frequent absences. One February evening, Mr. Hale, blushing as he asked the question, suddenly said, "Margaret, have you ever had any reason to think that Mr. Thornton cared for you?" Margaret did not answer immediately, then bent her head and said, "Yes, I believe... Oh, father, I should have told you." And dropping her work, she hid her face in her hands. "No, dear, there was no need. I am sure you would have told me if you had returned his feelings. Did he speak to you about it?" No answer at first, then a slow, "Yes." "And you refused him?" A long sigh and another, "Yes." Then, blushing even more, she said, "Now, father, I have told you this, but I cannot tell you more. It is too painful for me. Oh, father, it is because of me that Mr. Thornton is no longer your friend, and I am so sorry, but I could not help it." They were quiet for some minutes. Mr. Hale stroked Margaret's cheek and was almost shocked to find her face wet with tears. As he touched her, she jumped up, smiling brightly, and began to talk about the Lennoxes with such eagerness to change the subject that he was too kind to refer to it again. "Tomorrow." "Yes, tomorrow the Lennoxes will be back in Harley Street. How strange it will be. Imagine, Edith a mother." "Why don't you go and see them for a fortnight?" said her father. "It would be very good for you, and Mr. Lennox could tell you his latest news about Frederick." "No, father, you need me here," said Margaret. After a pause, she continued sadly, "I am losing hope about Frederick. Mr. Lennox is trying to tell us the news gently, but you can see from his letters that he thinks there is no hope of finding witnesses." A few days later, Margaret's feelings were confirmed when Frederick wrote, saying that he had received a letter from Henry Lennox, stating that it was unlikely that the witnesses could be found. Frederick angrily said that he no longer considered himself English, which made Margaret cry. But in March, a much happier letter arrived. Frederick and Dolores had got married. Dolores's family owned a large manufacturing company, and Frederick was now certain to achieve a high position in it. Margaret smiled a little when she learnt this, remembering her former dislike of trade. And now her brother was a trader. Well, it did not matter at all, and Frederick was very, very happy. Spring came, and Margaret became a little worried about her father, who occasionally had difficulty breathing. When Mr. Bell invited them to visit him in Oxford, she persuaded Mr. Hale to accept, hoping that it would improve his health. The invitation included Margaret, but she decided to stay at home. With her father away, she would have no responsibilities and would be able to rest, something that she had not been able to do since she came to Milton. Margaret was astonished at how relieved she felt once her father had left. The pressure was gone. There was no one who depended on her for comfort and entertainment. For months she had had no time to think about her problems, but now she could examine them one by one and give each of them the right place in her life. She sat almost motionless for hours, remembering every detail of her relationship with Mr. Thornton. After 2 days of silent thinking, she decided that if only she could be friends with him again, or even if he would visit her father more often, she would feel happier. But when she went to bed that night, a feeling of sorrow and anxiety still remained. That April evening, Margaret had found that she could not stop thinking about her father. Strangely, that same night in Oxford, all Mr. Hale's thoughts were about his daughter. His old friends there were very kind to him, but the unfamiliar social activity had made him feel quite exhausted. "I am tired," he told Mr. Bell, "but I am 55 years old." "Nonsense. I'm over 60. You're quite a young man." Mr. Hale shook his head. "These last few years," he said, and then after a pause he went on. "About Margaret. If I die—" "Nonsense." "I often think, what will happen to her? I suppose the Lennoxes will ask her to live with them. I hope they will. You know how fond I am of that girl, Hale. She has made me her slave. I will look after her, and when I die, everything I have will be hers. But you're a thin, healthy fellow, unlike me. There are no prizes for guessing who will die first." But Mr. Bell was wrong. And that night, Mr. Hale lay down in his bed for the last time. The servant who entered in the morning received no answer to his words. Mr. Hale's heart had stopped during the night, but his calm, beautiful face showed no pain, only the white, cold look of death. Mr. Bell was so shocked that he could not speak for some time. Then he told his servant to pack his bags and took the next train to Milton. There was only one person sitting near him. The man's face was hidden behind a newspaper, and it was some time before Mr. Bell realized that it was Mr. Thornton. The two shook hands, and when Mr. Bell told the mill owner the bad news, Mr. Thornton said nothing for over a quarter of an hour. Finally, he said, "What about—" and stopped suddenly. "Margaret, you mean? Yes, I am going to Milton to tell her. I will look after her as if she were my own child. I would like her to come and live with me, but there are those Lennoxes." "Who are they?" asked Mr. Thornton, trembling with interest. "Oh, fashionable London people. Captain Lennox married her cousin, the girl she was brought up with. And there's her aunt, Mrs. Shaw. And then there's that brother." "What What brother? The brother of Captain Lennox, a clever young lawyer. I'm told he's been interested in Margaret for a long time. Now that she will have money, he will be even more interested in her. What money? Asked Mr. Thornton, far too interested to realise how rude the question was. Well, she'll have my money at my death. Mr. Thornton became very silent when he heard this. Finally, Mr. Bell asked him where he had been, and the mill owner explained that he had been to France on business. Ah, commerce. Poor old Hale. Milton is so different from Helston, a charming little village in the New Forest. I understand it was a great change for Mr. Hale. When Mr. Bell arrived at the house in Compton, Margaret, who was standing at an upstairs window, saw him get out of the carriage alone, and guessed the truth immediately. She stood in the middle of the sitting room, looking as if she had been turned into stone. "Oh, don't tell me. I know it from your face. You would not have left him if he were alive. Oh, father, father!" The shock was very great, and for more than 2 days Margaret lay on the sitting-room sofa with her eyes closed, hardly speaking at all. Mr. Bell needed to return to Oxford and make arrangements for the funeral, which would be held there rather than in Milton, because of the problems of transporting the body. However, it was clear that Margaret was not well enough to travel to Oxford to attend the funeral. After a lot of thought, Mr. Bell decided to write to Mrs. Shaw, who had returned to England, and ask her to come to Milton. His letter to her had an immediate effect, and the following day she travelled up by train. Margaret was the first to hear her aunt's carriage when it stopped in front of the house. Her whole face trembled, and when Mr. Bell came up with Mrs. Shaw, she was standing up, looking very unsteady. Her aunt opened her arms, and Margaret went into them and started to cry. Mr. Bell crept out of the room and went down to the study. There he tried to forget his troubles by examining the books, but they only reminded him of his dead friend. He was glad to hear the sound of Mr. Thornton's voice at the front door, and called out, "Thornton, is that you? Come in for a minute or two." The mill owner joined him, and Mr. Bell told him that Mrs. Shaw had come to look after Margaret. "The woman has brought a servant with her, and I shall have to leave and find somewhere to stay." "Come and stay with us. We have 5 or 6 empty bedrooms." "Then I'll just go upstairs and say good-bye to the poor girl and that aunt, and leave with you immediately." It was some time before Mr. Bell came down again, and as they set out for Marlborough Street, he explained why. "Mrs. Shaw is anxious to return home with Margaret as soon as possible. She doesn't seem to understand that the girl cannot travel in her present condition. Margaret said she has friends she must see, but then she started crying and said she was glad to leave a place where she had suffered so much. I must return to Oxford tomorrow, so a decision must be made." Mr. Thornton did not reply. The words, She was glad to leave a place where she had suffered so much, were going round and round in his head. So that was the way Margaret would remember her time in Milton, when to him every moment he had spent with her had been so precious. They arrived in Marlborough Street, and Mrs. Thornton, after welcoming Mr. Bell, asked how Margaret was. "She seems completely broken. I would like her to live with me, but she has relations who want her to live with them in London." "Where have these relations been when Miss Hale has had so many troubles?" Having asked the question, Mrs. Thornton, who felt no interest in the answer, left to prepare Mr. Bell's room. "They have been living abroad," Mr. Bell said. "The aunt brought her up, and Margaret and her cousin have been like sisters. But I wanted her as a child of my own, and I am jealous of these people who don't seem to have looked after her properly. It would be different if Frederick claimed her." "Frederick?" exclaimed Mr. Thornton. "Who is he?" "Frederick," said Mr. Bell in surprise. "Don't you know? He's her brother. Have you not heard?" "I have never heard his name before. Where is he? Who is he?" "He is the son who was involved in that mutiny." "I had never heard of him until this moment. Where does he live?" "In Spain. He's likely to be arrested if he comes to England." "Was he here in Milton at the time of Mrs. Hale's death?" "No, it's not possible. What made you think he was?" "I saw a young man walking with Miss Hale one day," replied Mr. Thornton, "and I think it was about that time." "Oh, that was probably young Lennox, the captain's brother. He's a lawyer, and Margaret and he write to each other. Do you know," said Mr. Bell, watching Mr. Thornton carefully, "when I last came here, I wondered if you, perhaps, cared for Margaret." "I admired Miss Hale, as everyone must. She is a beautiful creature," said Mr. Thornton quickly. "Is that all? A beautiful creature? You talk about her as if she were a horse or dog." Mr. Thornton's eyes flashed for a moment. "Mr. Bell," he said, "you should remember that not every man can talk about their feelings as freely as you. Let us talk about something else." The two men began to discuss business matters. A new building was being put up in Mr. Thornton's factory yard, and Mr. Bell asked what it would be. Mr. Thornton explained that he planned it as a dining room for his workers, and told Mr. Bell the following story. He had slowly become friendly with one of his workers, a man called Higgins. Passing by the man's house one day, he had called on him, and had been shocked to see how little the family had to eat, and what bad quality the meat was. After discussions with Higgins, the mill owner decided to buy large quantities of good quality food at a cheap price, and to provide a large oven at the mill and a cook. For some months now, the workers had been able to have a good lunch there. Mr. Thornton had even started eating with the men from time to time, and was enjoying his conversations with them. "I am really getting to know some of them now. They have such a sense of humour. But it is not a charity, and the men pay me rent for the oven and the cooking place at the back of the mill. They will have to pay more for the dining room. Mrs. Shaw hated noisy, smoky Milton and wanted to return to London the day after the funeral in Oxford. Margaret was too weak and exhausted to resist her, and it was agreed that she would return with her aunt and that Dixon would stay behind to pack up the furniture. The day before the funeral, Margaret received a letter from Mr. Bell in Oxford. My dear Margaret, I intended to return to Milton after the funeral, but unfortunately I have duties here that mean I cannot come. Captain Lennox and Mr. Thornton are here. The captain will come to Milton to take you and his mother home, and I have asked my lawyer to arrange the sale of your house. Now, there is something else. You may not know this, but I told your father that when I die, you will inherit my money and my possessions. I don't intend to die yet, of course. But meanwhile, I would like to make a formal arrangement to give you £250 a year. It is yours, and you can pay the Lennoxes this for as long as you live with them. They can then pay for Dixon. I will make another arrangement about money for your needs, items such as pretty dresses and chocolate. Now, Margaret, you may be wondering what right an old man has to settle your affairs in this way. But I have loved your father for 35 years, and I have no relations to look after or give my money to. Please make an old man happy, and tell me that Margaret Hale is not the girl to say no. Write to me and tell me your answer, but do not thank me. After reading this, Margaret took a pen and wrote with a trembling hand, Margaret Hale is not the girl to say no. For the next 2 days, she wandered round the house, trying to decide which things she wanted to keep. She asked Dixon to take one of her father's books to Mr. Thornton after she had left, and wrote a note to him very quickly. The day after the funeral, she took a carriage to the Higgins and said a sad goodbye to them. Feeling that she should also say goodbye to Mrs. Thornton, although she did not wish to do this, she went to visit her with her aunt, and Mrs. Thornton, looking kinder than ever before, was introduced to Mrs. Shaw. "Where are you going to live, Miss Hale?" Mrs. Thornton asked. "Mr. Bell told me that you were going to leave Milton." "My niece will live with me in London. She is almost like a daughter to me," said her aunt, looking fondly at Margaret. At this moment, Mr. Thornton entered the room. He had only just returned from Oxford. "John," said his mother, "this lady is Mrs. Shaw, Miss Hale's aunt. I am sorry to say that Miss Hale's visit is to say goodbye." "You are going, then?" he said in a low voice. "Yes," said Margaret. "We leave tomorrow." Mr. Thornton turned away and seemed to be examining something on the table. He did not even seem to be aware that they had got up to leave, but he went outside with them and helped Mrs. Shaw into the carriage. He and Margaret were standing close together on the doorstep, and the memory of the day of the riot came back to both of them. He thought of how cruel she had been to him when he had gone to see her the next day, and although his heart was beating fast with his love for her, he told himself, "Let her go, with her stony heart and her beauty. How coldly she looks at me. Let her go." And there was no tone of regret or emotion in his voice as he said goodbye. He took the hand she offered to him as if it were a dead flower, but no one saw Mr. Thornton again that day. Chapter 13. A New Life. Edith gave birth to her second child and, as was the custom, remained quietly in her room for several weeks afterwards. Consequently, the house in Harley Street was less busy than usual, and Margaret was able to rest and try to understand the sudden change that had taken place in her life. Once again, she was well looked after and living in a luxurious house. Mrs. Shaw and Edith were delighted that she had returned home, and Captain Lennox was kind and brotherly to her. Margaret felt that it was almost ungrateful of her to have a secret feeling that the Helston vicarage and even the little house in Milton were much more like her idea of home. Just as she was starting to feel bored, Edith came downstairs, and the normal life of the household began again. As she used to do, Margaret answered her cousin's notes for her, and reminded her of her social engagements. She loved playing with Sholto, Edith's little boy, and looked after both children while the servants had lunch. But because her father had died so recently, she was not yet able to go out socially, and while the rest of the family went out almost every day, she was often left alone. Then her thoughts returned to Milton, and she compared her life there with her comfortable life in Harley Street. She was becoming bored, and was afraid that she would forget that there was a world of servants and workers with all their hopes and fears. There seemed to be an emptiness in her life now. When she suggested this to Edith, her cousin stroked her cheek and said, "Poor child! Soon, when Henry returns from his travels, we will start having dinner parties again, and you will feel more cheerful, poor darling." But Margaret did not feel that dinner parties were the answer to her problems. Dixon was still in Milton, and Margaret missed her greatly. She read the servants' letters eagerly, hoping for news of friends. Dixon mentioned Mr. Thornton quite frequently, as he often gave her advice about the Hales' business affairs. Then, at the end of June, when the house in Milton had been sold, she came to London, in her new role as Margaret's servant. She brought a lot of Milton gossip with her. Fanny Thornton had got married and had a very grand wedding, paid for by her brother. Dixon had organised a sale of furniture, and Mrs. Thornton had bought several pieces and paid too little, while Mr. Thornton had bought others and paid too much. She did not have much to say about the Higgins family, but believed that Nicholas was well. She had heard that Mary had gone to work at Mr. Thornton's mill as a cook, which sounded strange to her. Why did the mill need a cook? Henry Lennox, who had been doing legal work in another part of the country, returned to London, and, as he had done in the past, spent a lot of time in Harley Street. He seemed even cleverer than before, although Margaret thought he had become colder. But the two shared similar intellectual interests, and unlike Edith and the captain, they enjoyed discussing a variety of subjects. Indeed, Margaret suspected that Mr. Lennox felt slightly contemptuous of his brother and sister-in-law and their aimless way of life. He and Margaret often saw each other, but always in the presence of others, and this helped them to relax and forget their embarrassment. Margaret suspected that Mr. Lennox tried to avoid being alone with her. But when he had made a particularly clever remark, she noticed that he would glance at her, as if he wanted to know what she thought of it. Mr. Bell wrote frequently, and in August, Margaret received a letter from him saying that he would visit her the following week. For several months he had been complaining that he felt unwell, and some days before his visit he wrote to say that he would come on Wednesday instead of Monday. But on Wednesday he did not appear, and the next morning a letter arrived from his servant explaining that Mr. Bell had postponed his visit because he had suddenly felt ill. Then, at the time that he was supposed to leave for London, he had suffered a heart attack, and the doctors did not think he would survive the night. Margaret received this letter at breakfast time, and her face went very pale as she read it. She silently put the letter into Edith's hands and left the room. Her cousin was very shocked by the news and started to cry. But when she had recovered a little, she went upstairs and found Dixon packing a small case. Margaret, who was putting on her hat, was sobbing, her hands trembling so much that she could hardly tie the strings. It was quickly agreed that Captain Lennox would accompany her to Oxford, and before midday the two were sitting in a train carriage. They arrived at Mr. Bell's house and learnt that he had died during the night. The news could not have been worse. But Margaret was glad that she was able to see the room where her father had died, and that she could say a quiet goodbye to the cheerful old man who had loved her so much. Captain Lennox fell asleep on the journey home, and Margaret spent the time crying and thinking of how, in the last year, she had lost her mother, her father, and now Mr. Bell. It seemed too much to bear. But then she arrived in Harley Street, and Edith and her aunt were so kind and gentle, and little Sholto was so happy to see her, that she began to feel better. And by the time she went up to bed, she was able to thank God that her dear old friend had suffered so little. "Will Margaret inherit Mr. Bell's money?" whispered Edith to her husband when she was alone with him that night. The captain, however, had no idea, and did not think that Mr. Bell had much money at all. Edith was disappointed to hear this, but a week later she came dancing towards her husband and said, "I am right and you are wrong, sir. Margaret has had a lawyer's letter, and she will inherit about £2,000, and also Mr. Bell's property in Milton, which is worth about £40,000. She will be a rich woman. And what does she say about it?" "Oh, she has known about it for some months apparently, but had no idea it was so much. She says she is afraid of the money, but that's nonsense and she'll soon get used to it." It seemed natural that Henry Lennox would be Margaret's legal adviser, and he often came to her with papers that needed signing. "Henry," said Edith one day with a little smile, "do you know how I expect your long conversations with Margaret to end?" "No, I don't," he said, reddening. "And I don't wish you to tell me. What you are thinking of may or may not happen. Please don't say anything to Margaret. She has been quite cool to me for a long time, and is only just beginning to be kind." Autumn came, and the family went on holiday to Cromer, a pretty town on the east coast. Margaret's troubles had made her quite weak, and the fresh sea air was just what she needed. She spent long hours sitting on the beach, and the gentle sound of the waves and the beauty of the sea and sky calmed her spirit. While Aunt Shaw went shopping and Edith and Captain Lennox went horse riding, Margaret thought about her time in Milton. Her greatest regret was that Mr. Thornton had never learnt the truth about why she had lied. But slowly she began to realize that she had a future, and her face, which had looked so pale and tight with pain, began to change. After 3 weeks, Henry Lennox, who had been in Scotland on business, came to join them, and he immediately noticed the difference in Margaret. "The sea has done Miss Hale a lot of good," he said one afternoon when she had left the room. "She looks 10 years younger than she did in Harley Street." "It's the hat I got her," said Edith delightedly. "I knew it would suit her the moment I saw it." "I'm sorry," said Mr. Lennox, "but I believe I know the difference between a pretty dress and a pretty woman. No hat could make Miss Hale's eyes so bright, or her lips so red. Her face is full of peace and light. She is even more beautiful than—" He lowered his voice. "The Margaret Hale of Helston." From this time, the clever and ambitious man used all his powers to win Margaret. He loved her intelligent mind and her sweet beauty, and saw the money she had inherited as only one part of her, although it could help him in his career. On his way back down from Scotland, he had visited Milton on business connected with Margaret, and it was clear to him that her property there was increasing in value. He was glad that in their new relationship of client and legal adviser, he had many opportunities to talk to her. Margaret was very willing to listen, providing he talked about Milton, and she was delighted that he admired its inhabitants almost more than she did. He praised their energy and their courage, and noticed that when Margaret got bored, if he mentioned Milton, her eyes would brighten and she would smile warmly at him. During her long hours of thinking on the beach, Margaret had realized that her life was her responsibility and no one else's. The result was that when the family returned to London, she told her aunt that she wanted to visit the poor and sick, as she had done in Helston. Mrs. Shaw did not wish to allow this at first, but Margaret was so sweetly persuasive that eventually she agreed. In their private conversations, Edith, Captain Lennox and Mrs. Shaw decided that it would be helpful to Henry if Margaret did not go out much socially. Margaret had other admirers, but her lack of interest in them was very obvious. they had noticed that Henry was the only man she really enjoyed talking to, and slowly the two became closer to each other. Chapter 14. Meeting Again. Meanwhile, in Milton, Mr. Thornton's financial troubles were growing more and more serious. The strike, more than a year and a half ago, had meant that he was unable to complete some of his business contracts. What made things worse was that in recent months the commercial value of cotton had fallen. Mr. Thornton's business was very badly affected, and he had spent a lot of money on expensive new machinery, with the result that now he did not have money when he needed it. No new orders were coming in, and meanwhile there were the huge expenses of paying the workers and maintaining the mill. Mr. Thornton did not despair, however. He was as calm and gentle to the women in his home as he had always been. He did not say much to his workers, but they understood his situation and were sympathetic. His relationship with them had changed greatly. Previously, his only ambition had been to be head of a firm that was known and respected all over the world. Now he often talked to the workers, particularly Higgins, and listened to what they had to say. These conversations had made him realize that people everywhere were connected by the same human feelings. He had begun to see that as a manufacturer, he was in a position to help and influence those less fortunate than him. He had even arranged to send the older Boucher children to school. Now, though, it seemed that he might lose this position, just as he was beginning to understand it. One afternoon, as Mr. Thornton was walking down Marlborough Street, absorbed in his thoughts, Higgins approached him. Noticing that the mill owner was looking even gloomier than usual, Higgins tried to think of something to cheer him up. "Have you heard any news of Miss Margaret lately?" he asked. "Miss who?" replied Mr. Thornton. "Miss Margaret. Miss Hale, the clergyman's daughter." "Oh, Miss Hale." Suddenly the worried look left Mr. Thornton's face, and he smiled warmly. "I'm her tenant now, you know, Higgins. I hear about her from her lawyer every now and then. She's well and living with friends. Thank you, Higgins." "Will she be coming to Milton again?" "No." Higgins came closer to Mr. Thornton and said in a low tone, "How is the young gentleman?" Seeing that the mill owner did not seem to understand, he continued, "The young gentleman. I mean, Frederick, her brother, who came to Milton." "He came to Milton?" "Yes, when their mother died. Don't be afraid I'll tell anyone. Mary told me. She found out about it when she was working at the house." "And he was here?" "It was her brother." "Yes, I thought you knew all about it, or I would never have said anything. I won't say another word." The conversation ended, and Mr. Thornton continued on his way, saying to himself, "It was her brother. I am so glad. I may never see her again, but it is a relief to know that. I knew she could never have done anything wrong, but I needed to be sure. I am so glad." This news was a little golden thread in his fortunes. Several American firms that he did business with had failed, and his financial situation was becoming more and more gloomy. Night after night, Mr. Thornton took his papers into his office and sat there long after his mother had gone to bed. One morning, when the first light of day was beginning to creep into the room, he realized that nothing could be done. He would have to give up the business that he had worked so hard to make a success. One hot summer evening, Edith came into Margaret's room, dressed for dinner. "Margaret, I need to talk to you. Henry has come to me and asked me if a Mr. Thornton of Milton, your tenant, you know, can join our dinner party tonight. It is such a nuisance. The arrangements were perfect, and now they must be changed." "I won't have dinner tonight. I don't want any," said Margaret in a low voice. "Dixon can bring me a cup of tea here. I will be really glad to lie down." "You can't do that. We need you. Mr. Colthurst, who is a member of Parliament, is coming, and you know we planned for you to talk to him about Milton." "Oh, I've just remembered. This Mr. Thornton comes from Milton. How fortunate! Mr. Colthurst is going to talk about the cotton industry in his next speech. He and Mr. Thornton will have a lot to say to each other. Really, I think Henry has done very well. I asked him if Mr. Thornton is a man one should be ashamed of. He said, 'Not if you have any sense, little sister.' So I suppose he can pronounce his H's." "Did Mr. Lennox say why Mr. Thornton had come to London?" asked Margaret, her voice sounding rather tight. "Oh, his business has failed, or something like that. I'm sure Henry told you that, the day you had such a headache. Anyway, he has said that Mr. Thornton has lost all his money and deserves our respect, and I must be very polite to him. And as I have no idea how to do that, I need you to help me. And now come down with me and rest on the sofa for half an hour." Henry Lennox came early, and Margaret, blushing as she spoke, asked him some questions about Mr. Thornton. "He can't afford to continue his payments for Marlborough Mills and the house, so he has come to discuss what can be done. I thought you would like him to come to the dinner party." Mr. Lennox had lowered his voice as he spoke to Margaret. Then, noticing that Mr. Thornton had just entered, he jumped up and introduced him to Edith and Captain Lennox. Margaret watched Mr. Thornton anxiously as he talked to them. She had not seen him for a long time, and his circumstances had changed completely. Being tall and well-built, he looked as impressive as ever, but there were lines of worry on his face that had not been there before. Still, thought Margaret, he had nobleness and strength that made people respect him immediately. Mr. Thornton's first glance around the room had shown him that Margaret was there. He had seen how carefully she listened to Mr. Lennox, and came up to her with the calm, friendly manner of an old friend. She blushed, and the colour did not leave her cheeks for the rest of the evening. But she did not seem to have much to say to him, and when others approached her, he moved away and began talking to Mr. Lennox. "Miss Hale is looking very well, is she not?" said Mr. Lennox. "I don't think Milton was very good for her. When she first came to London, I thought I had never seen anyone so changed. Tonight she is looking wonderful, and she is so much stronger now. Last autumn, a 2-mile walk made her tired. On Friday, we walked for 6 miles at least. We? Who? Just the two of them? Wondered Mr. Thornton. Dinner began, and during the meal Mr. Colthurst, the Member of Parliament, heard enough of Mr. Thornton's conversation to want to meet him. He asked Edith who the gentleman was, and when she told him that he was Mr. Thornton of Milton, exclaimed, "Mr. Thornton of Milton?" clearly recognising the name. Edith was pleased. Her dinner party was going well. Henry was being amusing, and Mr. Thornton and Mr. Colthurst were busy talking in a corner of the room. Margaret did not speak much, but was looking so beautiful that it did not matter. She was watching Mr. Thornton's face and noticing the changes in him. He only smiled once, that brilliant smile that she remembered so well, and he glanced at her, almost as if he wanted her approval. But then his expression changed, and he avoided looking at her again. After dinner, the ladies went upstairs, and Margaret, who did not feel like talking, started to do some sewing. The gentlemen soon followed, and as Mr. Colthurst and Mr. Thornton were standing near her, she was able to listen to their conversation. "My business has failed," Mr. Thornton said, "and I am looking for a position in Milton where I can experiment with some ideas that I have." "What experiments are these?" asked Mr. Colthurst respectfully. "I now believe that an organisation can be much more successful if the employers and workers talk freely to one another and see each other as people. If an employer has a new plan, the workers may not realise how carefully he has thought about it. But if he discusses it with his workers, they will feel they are part of it and will want it to be successful." "And you think this may prevent strikes?" "Not at all, but it might mean that the strikers aren't so bitter and so full of hatred." Suddenly Mr. Thornton turned and walked up to Margaret, as if he knew she was listening. "Miss Hale," he said, "I had a letter from some of my men, saying that they wished to work for me if I was ever in a position to employ them again. That was good, wasn't it?" "Yes, how wonderful! I am so glad," said Margaret. She looked straight at him with her expressive eyes, then looked down when he looked back at her. He gazed at her for about a minute, as if he did not know what to say next. Then he sighed and said, "I knew you would be pleased," and turned away and did not speak to her again until he wished her good night very formally. As Mr. Lennox was leaving, Margaret said hesitantly, "Can I speak to you tomorrow? I want your help about something." "Certainly. I will come at whatever time you wish." "At 11? I will see you then." His eyes brightened with pleasure. How she was learning to depend on him. It seemed as if any day now she would make her feelings about him clear. And then he could once again ask her to marry him. Edith moved around the house very quietly the next morning, as if any sudden noise would disturb the meeting that was taking place in the sitting room. 2 o'clock came, and Margaret and Mr. Lennox still sat there behind closed doors. Then there was the sound of a man's footsteps running downstairs. Edith opened the sitting-room door. "Well, Henry?" she said. "Well, what?" he said rather shortly. "Come in to lunch." "No, thank you, I can't. I've lost too much time here already." "Then it's not all settled?" said Edith sadly. "No, not at all, if you mean what I think you mean. It will never happen, Edith, so give up thinking about it." "If Margaret lived near me, it would be so nice for us all," said Edith, who did not want Henry to give up hope. "At the moment, I am always afraid she will go and live in Cadiz." "I am certain that Miss Hale would not marry me, and I shall not ask her." "Then what have you been talking about?" "Business matters." "Oh, go away if that's all." "I shall. I am coming again tomorrow and bringing Mr. Thornton with me, as he needs to talk to Miss Hale." "Mr. Thornton? Why?" "He is Miss Hale's tenant," said Mr. Lennox, turning away. "And he can no longer afford to rent the mill." No one ever knew why Mr. Lennox did not keep his appointment the following day. Mr. Thornton arrived punctually, after he had waited for nearly an hour. Margaret came in looking very white and anxious. "I am so sorry Mr. Lennox is not here," she said hurriedly. "He could have done it so much better. He is my adviser in this." "I am sorry if it worries you. Shall I try to find him?" "No, thank you. I wanted to tell you how sorry I am that I am going to lose you as a tenant. But Mr. Lennox has told me that he feels sure you will regain your former position. Please don't speak until I have finished." Margaret turned over some papers in a trembling, hurried manner and continued. "Oh, here it is. He has written a document showing that if you would borrow some money of mine, about £18,000 that is lying unused in the bank, you could pay me better interest than I have now, and Marlborough Mills could continue." Mr. Thornton did not speak, and she went on looking for some papers, as if she was very anxious that he would see the arrangement as being advantageous for her. But her heart almost seemed to stop beating when Mr. Thornton said, in a voice that trembled with passion, "Margaret." She looked up, and then tried to hide her expressive eyes by hiding her head in her hands. He came nearer, and said her name again in the same passionate way. Her head sank even lower. He came close to her, and knelt by her side, and whispered, "Be careful. If you do not speak, I shall claim you as my own. Send me away at once if I must go. Margaret." She turned and laid his head on her shoulder, still with her face in her hands. It was delicious for him to feel her soft cheek against him. He held her close, but they did not speak. Finally she whispered, "Oh, Mr. Thornton, I am not good enough." "Not good enough? It is I who am not good enough." After a minute or two, He gently removed her hands from her face and put her arms around his shoulders as they had been on the day of the riot. "Do you remember, love?" he asked. "Yes, and I remember how cruel I was to you the next day." "Lift your head. I have something to show you." Blushing, she raised her head. "Do you recognize these roses?" he asked, taking some dead flowers out of a book that he had with him. "No," she replied. "Did I give them to you?" "No, you did not, but you have probably worn roses like these." She looked at them, thought for a minute, then smiled a little and said, "They are from Helston, are they not?" "Oh, have you been there? When did you go?" "I wanted to see the place where Margaret grew up, even when I had no hope of winning you. I went there after I returned from France." "You must give them to me," she said, trying to take them out of his hand. "You may have them, but you must pay me for them." "How can I ever tell Aunt Shaw?" she whispered, after some minutes of delicious silence. "Let me speak to her." "Oh, no, I should tell her. But what will she say?" "I can guess. She will exclaim, 'That man!'" "Be careful," said Margaret, "or I will imitate the way your mother will say, 'That woman!'"